have seen this painting all over social media, but do you know the story behind this painting? Trigger warning, we will talk about sexual assault in this video. I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and I'm an art historian, and this is Art Trippin Lecture Series. Hi, I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and this is Art Trippin. Okay, so what is this painting? This is Judith slaying Holofernes. This is a story from the book of Judith in which this noble Bethulian woman protects her town by sneaking into the enemy's camp, to the Assyrian army's camp, pretending that she has defected, entering into the private tent of the general Holofernes, seducing him, getting him a little drunk with wine, and then when he has let his guard down, she jumps in there and slices off his head. That's right. Judith beheads Holofernes. If you look at this painting, you can see that Judith has grabbed onto Holofernes' beard to help her with the leverage of sawing this head off. Blood is dripping down the bed and shooting out of his neck. And if you zoom in really closely, you can see blood stains on her dress and even on her cleavage that's pushed up. There's a little splattering of blood. You can see that Judith is aided here by her maidservant, who is actively participating, helping to hold this man down as he is fighting back for his life. This painting by Artemisia Gentileschi is now on view in the Uffizi galleries in Florence, Italy. But the first time yours truly, Prof. D, went to Italy, this was not on view. This painting was back in storage and had been attributed to her father. So what's the story with Artemisia Gentileschi? Artemisia Gentileschi was one of the few famous, successful women artists during the Baroque period. She was born into a family of painters. Her father was a painter, Orazio Gentileschi. You've surely heard of or seen his works in museums because he was a well-respected Baroque artist. But she was his daughter who actually had a successful career in her lifetime. And she was one of the few women that have been rescued by feminist art historians from art historical oblivion. In fact, at the time of her life, she was wildly successful. She was well known and financially successful. And then in the hundreds of years that followed her death, she was written out of history. Many of her paintings were left in storage and attributed to her father, Orazio, because perhaps they bore the name Gentileschi. It was only in the 1990s that feminist art historians went into the archives, found letters and paperwork and receipts, and realized that so many of these paintings that had been lost to oblivion were actually attributed to Artemisia herself. Her father, Orazio, was an artist and was a follower or friend of Caravaggio. Perhaps we would call him one of the Caravaggisti. And Artemisia, at a young age, started painting in her father's studio. Now, she had brothers, and those brothers painted in the studio as well. But the truth is that Artemisia was the most talented in the family, and that eventually she would take over the family's workshop. But not before a very formative and difficult moment in her life. So it was typical for an artist to take on an apprenticeship. So at a certain age, she took on an apprenticeship and was working under her teacher, Tassi. However, at a certain point, she was, trigger warning, sexually assaulted by her teacher. It was also commonplace that a woman would not be left unattended with a man. So Gentileschi would have had a maidservant or a chaperone with her. And apparently the chaperone did nothing to protect or help her, and in fact spoke out against her when she was on trial. What do you mean she was on trial? Why was Gentileschi on trial for her own rape? Well, women in the Baroque period were pretty much considered property of their fathers until they were married off when they became property of their husbands. So for Gentileschi's father, Orazio, he would not be able to marry off Artemisia because of what Tassi had done. So Orazio Gentileschi took Tassi to court. And how do we know this? There's literally court documents. There's literally a transcript of this trial. We can actually read Artemisia Gentileschi's own words because we have documents of this trial that was brought by Orazio Gentileschi against the painter Agostino Tassi, who is accused of sexually assaulting Artemisia. Now, during the course of the trial, basically this was a, sort of he said, she said kind of thing, where Agostino Tassi is basically suggesting that it was consensual and using Artemisia's chaperone as evidence. So here the chaperone is really failing Artemisia, not really showing solidarity. In the course of the trial, there is a Baroque era sort of lie detector test, which is pretty gruesome. So what happens is that Artemisia Gentileschi's hands are broken. The idea is that you're a painter, the worst thing that could happen to you is that your hands could be broken. So the idea is that we're going to torture her and we're going to threaten to break her hands, and so she will confess the truth that she was a willing participant. And in the course of this trial, her hands were broken. She sustained that horrible injury and it never caved. So in the end, it was seen that she was telling the truth, that she actually was assaulted by her teacher. And in the end, Tassi was meant to pay some fees to Orazio Gentileschi, but Tassi fled the scene and never really did his time. So some scholars and art historians believe that because of this very traumatic moment in her life as a young adult, that this influenced her work and that she saw herself in some of these heroines and women from biblical and mythological history. And in fact, if you look at Artemisia Gentileschi's self-portrait as the allegory of painting, La Pittura, here she is in 1638 depicting herself as sort of the muse of painting in the act of painting. So now, if you look at her self-portraits and you look at two of her Judith slaying Holofernes, so there's two examples. There's Judith slaying Holofernes from 1614, or there's Judith beheading Holofernes from 1618. In both cases, if you really look at the face of Judith, you might see a resemblance to Artemisia Gentileschi. So perhaps Gentileschi is sort of living out some of her frustrations through what she lived through with the assault and the trial. And some scholars say that she's sort of living out these revenge fantasies. I would say she might be living out her ideas as a strong woman and a woman who is acting in solidarity with other women. So you will notice in both of these depictions of Judith that the maidservant is helping Judith. She's helping to hold down Holofernes. And this is arguably what Gentileschi would have wanted her maidservant to do in the instance of her assault and her trial. Now, if we look at Artemisia Gentileschi's depiction of this subject matter next to Caravaggio's Judith and Holofernes from about 1598, we can see that Caravaggio strongly influenced Gentileschi's style. Caravaggio laid the foundation for the Baroque period with these tight compositions, these flat, dark backgrounds, this dramatic tenebrism, and this drama of action. However, if you look at the depictions of Judith, you will get a very different experience. And I would argue that this is due to the gendered and lived experiences of the artists. Caravaggio's Judith, first of all, is wearing all white and there's not a speck of blood on her. And there's a great deal of distance between Caravaggio's Judith and Caravaggio's Holofernes. Caravaggio's Judith is almost reluctantly completing the task because perhaps Caravaggio cannot imagine a woman committing a violent act. Judith, in Artemisia Gentileschi's version, is not afraid to get in there. She has actually pushed her sleeves up, climbed up on the bed. It's hard to see, but in the painting, she actually has got her thigh up on the bed, holding down Holofernes with her knee, and she's got in there and she is sawing that head off. You can see that Artemisia Gentileschi's Judith is stout, she's strong, she's got big arms, she's not as dainty and delicate as Caravaggio's Judith, and Gentileschi's Judith is just getting in there. She is not holding back because she has experienced life in the body of a woman, and she knows that anger and that female rage that is coming out through this depiction of Judith. We can see similar subject matter when we look at other paintings by Gentileschi, including her depictions of Susanna and the Elders, a similar story of a woman being treated unfairly by these men. And if you look at Gentileschi's version of this painting next to Tintoretto's, you can see that Gentileschi's Susanna is very much reluctant and very much rejecting these two elder men, whereas Tintoretto's Susanna is sort of unaware of these peeping toms, these false accusers, who in the end get their due. The false accusers are put to death and virtue triumphs. But you can see this same subject matter throughout Artemisia Gentileschi's work, where she's really expressing that female rage through her powerful, strong, and in many cases, violent depictions of women during the Italian Baroque. Okay, what do you think? Are you a super fan of Artemisia Gentileschi now too? Let me know in the comments. Do you want me to explain some more of her art, or are there any other women artists that you want to know about? Sound off in the comments. Thanks for watching Art Trippin lecture series, and stay tuned for more on the Baroque.